Hey everyone, I'm Will Richardson from the Big Questions Institute, and I want to thank you for spending some time with me today, about 30 minutes or so, just to take a look at the world of education here in the middle of this pandemic moment that we're in, to talk a little bit about how we may need to shift our thinking in terms of moving forward from this moment, and also some of the ways in which we're going to have to embrace change in this very complex and uncertain moment that we're moving toward. And speaking of uncertainty, I want you to know that I am recording this during our election day here in the United States. There is so much uncertainty today. I'm feeling a little nauseous, if you want to be honest. But hopefully things will turn out for the best, although as we've seen in the past, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. And I know I'm on edge, and a lot of us are on edge, but I'm actually looking forward to taking this little respite from that conversation to do this presentation for you today. So the title of this presentation is "We Are Not Disrupted Enough Yet," believe it or not, and I want to talk about why real change in schools will take more than a pandemic to really move us forward. And it's not that basically, it's not that things are necessarily getting worse, although one might argue that. I mean, the pandemic obviously has been something that's kind of come out of the blue. But what this moment is doing, it's uncovering a whole bunch of things that we've kind of known about education for a while, but that we really have been kind of loath to talk about. And I want to discuss some of those unpleasant truths as we go through this presentation today. It's really been my great honor and my great pleasure to be working with a group of international school heads for the past 36 weeks. Actually, this will be week 37 when we'll get together on Thursday morning at 8 a.m. in New York time. And we've been talking about, obviously, the logistical hurdles that they have had to navigate as they try to figure out, first of all, how to move schools online, but then also now how to reopen them and then maybe toggle back and forth. And it's, as you can imagine, it's been exhausting. A lot of these folks are at their limits. And so while we do talk a lot about how for a good chunk of time, we just kind of listen to one another and we give each other support. And it's been a really powerful thing on some level, right? It's been difficult, there's no question about that. But on some level, there's been a real sense of community, and there's been this just acknowledgement that we are learning so much right now. I'd like to say that this may be the most powerful learning moment for educators, maybe ever, at least in our lifetimes. And then what I'd like to also point out, however, or like to ask is, but how does the learning that we're doing in this moment map to the learning that our kids are doing in classrooms right now? And the unfortunate answer to that is it doesn't look a lot like that. We're solving problems. We're doing real world things. We're in the moment. We're working with other people. It's transparent, and it lives in the world. Whereas so much of what our kids are still doing in classrooms is still pretty much what they've been doing in the past. Now it's being mediated through technology in lots of cases, but there hasn't been that huge shift, that huge change in terms of what they actually do. So I think that in these environments and working with these people, and also just having these opportunities to see what online learning looks like and to try to configure it in ways that are best for teachers and kids and all the complexities of that. I think we have learned a lot. We have learned a lot in this moment. There is no question about it. The obvious one, like I mentioned, we have learned to shift to technology. The pandemic has probably sped that up by numbers of years. I think we were going to get there eventually, but now we're at a moment where I don't think any of us can look at our practice and say we're not going to have an online offering for some kids. I think we've also learned, however, that there are lots of kids and lots of teachers that are actually flourishing in this environment, that they actually like this environment. They're more comfortable in it. It's just a better use of their time. And so, like I said, we're going to have to keep offering that. There's no question. We've been able to learn that we can build community in these spaces. I mean, really tight-knitted communities, doing work together and, again, supporting one another in ways that I think a lot of people are kind of surprised at, actually. There is this sense that we're all in this together, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second as well. And then, there's also the kind of downsides to this. One of them is we've learned that hybrid teaching and learning really isn't that great. It kind of sucks, actually. The Room and Zoom that a lot of us are trying to do right now is just, again, just exhausting people, and it's not sustainable. It's just not going to continue to be something that we can do. We have to. It's almost easier if we just made a commitment to going fully online or fully face to face for as long as we can. But this kind of going back and forth thing is just not happening. It's just not helping us very much at all, teachers or students right now. We've learned that there is unequal access in the world. Some kids don't have access. Lots of kids don't have access, actually. And it's not even just access to the technology as much as it is access to support, access to other types of materials. That's a big issue that's going on right now. It's not that the tests, the other thing that we've learned, I think, is that a lot of tests that have been postponed, SAT tests, ACT tests, IB tests, you almost can run down the whole list of all those initials. Hey, we're doing okay without them. We set them aside this year, and that basically, I think we're noticing that that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think that we've gotten our head kind of out of tests and this idea that, that we need to have tests to move us forward. So, I think that all of this stuff, and there's much more obviously, but all of this stuff suggests that there's a lot of potential change that we can do in education. But I still believe it's not going to happen when it's all about this kind of more surfacey stuff that we're doing. And right now what you're hearing a lot is that people are saying, I just want to get back to normal. I just want to get back to the way that it was before. And it's it's a very, very strong pull back to normal right now. There's no question about that. But here's the thing, right? Normal wasn't that great to begin with. It really wasn't. I mean, look at where we are in the world today. I mean, just at a meta level, normal was not really a great reality. And in schools, it was the same way. And in schools, we really have to deal with these kinds of unpleasant truths that have been around for a long, long time, but that now we're going to have to acknowledge. And one of them is that basically learning is a very natural thing, but schools are pretty much unnatural spaces for learning. I love this quote by Carol Black, who's one of my favorite authors, and I'm going to read this just very quickly, but it's I think will put you in the headspace where you have to consider what a gap there is between the two things. Any wildlife biologist knows that an animal in a zoo will not develop normally if the environment is incompatible with the evolved social needs of its species. But we no longer know this about ourselves. We have radically altered our own evolved species behavior by segregating children artificially in same-age peer groups instead of mixed-age communities, by compelling them to be indoors and sedentary for most of the day, by asking them to learn from text-based artificial materials instead of contextualized real-world activities, by dictating arbitrary timelines for learning rather than following the unfolding of a child's developmental readiness. Common sense should tell us that all of this will have complex and unpredictable results. And here's kind of the money quote from Carol Black, where she says, collecting data on human learning based on children's behavior in school is like collecting data on killer whales based on their behavior at SeaWorld. And, I think that we kind of know this, right? And one of the things that is increasingly clear is that we learn in the real world in ways that don't look anything like we learn in school. I'll tell you this quick story about this young man from India who was so upset by all of the attacks that were happening in his neighborhood that he decided to create a shoe, which if you're wearing it and you kick your attacker, it will electrocute that person. And what I love about this story is that he kind of gives us a sense of how difficult this was and what the learning process looked like for him. And he says, the invention process was an uphill climb. I ran into countless problems. With the help of many great mentors from LinkedIn and social media, I taught myself programming in various languages. I would spam them every time my code didn't work. My prototype failed 17 times. While experimenting, I faced electrocution twice, and my friend developed a nosebleed. It took me 2 years to build a working prototype, but in the end, the hard work paid off, and I was able to create a working prototype of the shoe, and I felt like a superhero. And it really does speak to this idea that there's just so much passion. There's so much, learning requires so much just interest and real world work for it to be meaningful in people's lives. He's not unique in that. And I wonder how many of our kids feel like superheroes. I wonder how many of them really go home from school thinking, God, I just created something that is really powerful and I feel like a superhero because of it. Now, we don't really talk about these types of things around learning very often in schools, ironically, right? Because that is really about what our work is about. But I've, over the last 6-7 years, in places all around the world, I've asked this question: what are the conditions for deep and powerful learning to take place? And you won't be surprised to hear that almost everyone answers that question. And I'm sure if you're thinking about that question, your answers are probably going to pop up here. Almost everybody answers that question with these types of answers. You need a safe learning environment. It has to be fun. There has to be real world application. There has to be passion involved. Has to be challenging. You have to have agency. This isn't rocket science. We know this. And almost everyone, when they answer this question, their answers fall within the bounds of that list. But here's what people never, ever, ever say when I ask them that question. Basically, the conditions for deep and powerful learning, first things that come to mind are not sitting in rows, separating kids out by age, putting grades all over everything, handing it in, limited access. So basically, we know this. This is not something that surprises us, but there is this very kind of interesting incoherence in the ways that we think about learning, but the ways that we practice learning in schools. And that is a real unpleasant truth. There's no question that that's a very difficult thing for us to understand. Some other unpleasant truths are most of what kids learn, they quickly forget, that basically the curriculum doesn't really reflect the world as it is today. And we don't need school any longer to get an education, actually. We can do that on our own, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so there are a lot of these unpleasant truths that are going to require us right now to kind of think about how do we reclaim our relevance in this moment. How do we begin to do that? And I think that one of the things, and this has become a big part of our work at the Big Questions Institute, is that we have to begin to see the world as it is, not as it was. And the world has fundamentally shifted in some really powerful ways. So I want to go through those shifts fairly quickly here. This is not a lot of time, but maybe in the Q&A that follows, we can have some conversations around this. So the first thing is that there are basically we think five new lenses that we have to begin to look at the world through, 5 new contexts for this. And I'm going to take each of these individually and spend just a couple minutes on each one. Again, we go into a lot more depth in our work with cohorts around how to just get deeply into a different way of seeing the world because of the ways that these changes are kind of playing out, right? So the first change here really revolves around this idea of the world, and that we are now all in this together. If the pandemic hasn't shown it to us, then basically the social unrest that's happening in the world is showing it to us. The climate crisis that is on the horizon is definitely showing us. We cannot think about schools situated simply in local contexts any longer. We have to begin to see our work as living in the world. We have to help our kids do real work in the world, because we're all in this together now, and we can't escape that. If we continue to kind of work in isolation or apart from one another, the world is not going to benefit from that. The only way that we kind of get through this right now is to come together in those spaces. So for each of these, I'm just going to put up a few questions that I think we have to be talking about and asking right now. How will teaching and learning connect more meaningfully to the larger world? How will you ensure that global learning and experiences are equitably accessible? And how will you engage in these from a place of humility and openness and curiosity? These are cultural in a lot of ways, but we are now, there's no question, moving from ecosystems, and this is an Otto Scharmer quote that I love, but we are moving from ecosystems to these ecosystems where we have to think of ourselves again as connected to everything that's going on. And schools are no exception to that, and have to be the places where we start with that. The next lens that we talk about is this idea of purpose, and our purpose as in school is changing. There's no question about it. There's a long conversation that we have about the purpose of school being a public good or a private good, and how that is shifting, and certainly that is shifting pretty powerfully right now. But here's the big shift that's happening, and that is we can no longer think about this as schooling. We have to think about it as learning. The reason that we have to do that, I think, is exemplified by that young man in India. We now have access to the sum of human knowledge in our pockets, pretty much. We have access to about 5 billion people who have internet connections. We have access to millions of different apps that are out there right now. And that's not to say that in the context of all these different things coming together that there isn't a lot of crap and there isn't a lot of crap detection that you have to do right now. Obviously, here in the United States, we have had to put on our crap detectors over the last year or so in this election. But it's not just this election. It's getting a lot more complicated. And we actually just did a webinar on the infodemic that is really difficult to navigate as well right now. But I think that the point here is that this new kind of world in which we're living in is all about learning. If you have access and you know what to do with it, you don't have to wait for a class and a teacher and some kids to be in a place where you're going through a curriculum and going through a particular examination any longer. You can just go out and start learning, and I think most of that are doing that right now. So our value and our purpose has to change right now. What is school now? How do we define that? What does it mean to be educated? That's a great question, and it's one that we challenge people a lot with. What is worth learning today, and how does that change it? And how can we make sure that our kids can learn their way through the world, much like many of you are learning your way through the world right now as well? The next lens is change, and it is this idea that change is now constant, and we are now moving not into a new normal, but we believe we're moving into a no normal. We're moving into a period now where there are going to be very few anchors. There are going to be very few things that we can kind of latch onto and say, yeah, it's going to be this way for a certain amount of time, and we can kind of depend on that. We're going to have to instead shift our brains around this idea that there's no normal right now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a different thing, right? So the ways that we think about what happens in classrooms and the ways we think about our own work has to shift away from this very consistent, very kind of calm, very kind of straightforward way of seeing the world and operating in the world, to this other kind of metaphoric whitewater space that John Seeley Brown and John Hagel talk a lot about, where everything changes in a moment, and that there is no one straight path through this. We are going to be buffeted by these rapids, by these changes in so many ways, and that for us to really navigate them, we're going to have to learn how to be flexible and roll and kind of speed up and slow down when necessary. And it's going to take a very different mindset and a very different group of dispositions to kind of get through that. So some questions around change. How do we build cultures around that? I mean, how do cultures embrace change and uncertainty? It's very difficult, right? Because it does challenge a lot of our old kind of traditions and the ways we think about it, about the world. How do we plan for change? And how inclusive is our change process? All of those things, I think, are extremely important right now. We have to get our cultures into a place where we understand as communities that this consistency or some sense of consistency is probably not going to be with us for quite some time at this point, and that we're going to have to help our kids develop the dispositions and the skills to kind of live in that uncertainty and hopefully thrive in that uncertainty as well. The next lens that we talk about is power, and this is a really interesting one that we don't talk about very much at all in school. But in the greater world, even though it may not seem like it in the headlines right now, but underneath, fundamentally, power is moving from the institution to the individual. I think you can see this in many different places around the world as people get together for protests, or they get together to start social movements or whatever else. Certainly technology has been an affordance for that, and it's something that a lot of people are beginning to use in order to seize power, take power back from those who maybe have held it for a long, long time. In schools, if we don't examine our power relationships, there will be no change. And that's a quote from Seymour Saracen. Saracen is someone who has influenced my thinking a great deal on this. And basically, we have to rethink the way that we look at power in our classrooms. Power requires that we give kids agency, that we make space for them, that we provide more freedom for them to pursue things on their own terms, again, like that young man in India. And I think that this is a great quote that kind of sums that up, right? By Sean Michael Morris, who's one of my favorite bloggers, who talks about, this is the right of agency. It does not give us power over another, but it gives us mastery over ourselves. And an education that does not encourage or facilitate this agency is not an education. An education that convinces us of what needs to be known, what is important versus what is frivolous, is not an education. It is training at best, conscription at worst. And all it prepares us to do is believe what we're told. And I do think that in many ways that's kind of playing out in my country right now, where people are so used to not having agency, not having power, that they just go with the flow. They just do what other people are telling them to do. And I think that we have to, again, develop some real skills around that and develop some new dispositions around that for our kids. So where does power reside in your school? If you did a power audit, who has power and how do they use it? And basically, does power lend itself to change, or is it retaining the status quo? A lot of people are using power to stay in the same place, to kind of run in place. And how can we shift power and amplify agency for learners as well? So those are some key questions around this idea of power. But again, if we're going to fundamentally change the way we think about our work in schools, that is going to have to be one of the lenses that we use to look at that work. Story is the fourth lens, or actually is the final lens that I want to talk about pretty briefly. Basically, it's the narrative that we carry around with us in terms of what the idea of school is. And we have a very deeply ingrained narrative in our heads around what school is supposed to look like, how it's supposed to function, how we're supposed to succeed, the language that we use. It's pretty hardwired into the DNA of not only schools themselves, but the stories that we tell about schools themselves. So the change here is that the narrative of education is absolutely shifting. The pandemic has accelerated this, but it was happening beforehand, there's no question. And basically, the new narrative is not that you go somewhere and get a degree, although that is still something, obviously, that is important to a lot of folks, and that's not going to go away anytime soon, but it may become more rare, certainly, again, because of access and because of the ways in which the pandemic is pushing it. But there is this kind of new narrative. There is this new story. And actually, to be honest, one of my own children is kind of living this out. She has a passion for doing biohacking and for health. And so she has done a lot of learning on her own, and through various jobs and positions that she's had, she has attained a pretty high level as a 23-year-old without a formal education per se. So this narrative is basically that, hey, we kind of create our own schools now. We develop our passions. We learn how to learn. We develop skills. We find and solve real problems. Education is something that is tacit. It's impactful. It's collaborative. And it's something that's desired. And you're seeing this play out now in lots of places around the world. Taiwan happens to be one of our favorite places because not only have they responded to the pandemic in ways that are exemplary, but even before that, they have been rethinking the ways that they structure schools and the way that they think about their schools moving forward. They have been moving from this idea of competition to competency. And basically, they are talking about moving to this idea of global citizenry, where it's intrinsic rather than extrinsic, and students design their own curriculum. And teachers are co-learners, and the well-being of students is basically the guiding innovation there. So basically, there are other places in the world that are beginning to do this, but the narrative is shifting, and I think we have to ask the questions. What are the stories of your school right now? Who's writing your story, and how are you telling that story? I always say, if you really want to know what the story is, go ask the local realtor who's trying to sell houses in your neighborhood, because that's obviously one of the biggest questions that they get. So those are 5 lenses that I think are pretty powerful and pretty important for us to consider when we look at our work. That basically we're all in this together, that our value is beginning to change, that change in and of itself is going to be ongoing, that we need to shift our power relationships, and that the narratives that we tell are going to have to change, and to be more about what we value around learning, not so much what we value around schooling. So in the couple minutes here that I have left, I just want to talk a little bit. So what do we do? I mean, how do we not just then think about fundamental change in this moment, and get to the root, get a little radical about the changes that we make, but how do we think about change moving forward? I think one of the ways to do that is to look at this moment as a contextual, being in the contextual era. And again, this is John Hagel. But basically, it's all about context, reading the context, responding to context. And that's a very different way of organizing and acting. And I guess, it really is about, are you reading the signs? Can you basically, can you kind of see what the markers are here and the ways in which when things happen in the world, when new innovations come up, or when the pandemic hits, or whatever else, that those are signals for the way that the arc of the world is going to happen as we move forward. So it is going to be a lot about seeing contexts and about understanding those contexts, and about thinking hard about what we want when we are done with this pandemic moment. Because as this essay from Arundhati Roy suggests, the pandemic is a portal. It is kind of this passage that we're going through right now. We're moving from one world to a new world, and this is going to be a fundamentally different space that we're going to be living in. And I love this quote where she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. And this one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And I think that is the choice that we have to make right now. What are we going to take with us through this moment? What are we going to leave behind? A lot of our work is to help people, educators, kind of figure out what's sacred right now. What are the things that 5 or 10 or 15 years from now you want to make sure that are still a part of the school experience that you provide for kids? And anything that isn't on that list is up for grabs right now, is up for a conversation. And most people do not talk about things like, well, we want the curriculum to be the same in 5 years. We want to make sure assessments are the same. We want to make sure that we're doing a lot of the systemic things the same way. We know the things that are sacred are, we want relationships, we want well-being, we want equity, we want justice. Those are the things that are really important. Those are the things we should be carrying through the portal. And a lot of the other schooly stuff that we do, those unpleasant truths, are maybe things that we want to just think about leaving behind. So I want to just leave with this quote too from, I had one more quote, but I don't have it in this presentation. So, but it is this idea that we need to see the world as explorers. We need to have this exploration kind of disposition, and be willing to ask these questions, and to be willing to engage in big questions, these tough kinds of existential questions that the pandemic is forcing us to consider, but that I don't think we've really found the bandwidth and the headspace to talk about yet. And I totally understand that, right? We have been having to iterate in the moment, and it has been, like I said before, extremely challenging, very complex, and very tiring. But at some point now, we're going to have to begin to have these conversations at more depth. That's what we're doing at the Big Questions Institute. I would hope that you could stop by and see us. We have a whole bunch of stuff going on that is, I think, edgy and challenging, but is helping people to engage in these very, very important conversations. And that's really what our work is about. So I hope you enjoyed that 30 minutes. I know I did. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I'll be having a smile on my face tonight, but we'll see how it goes. But at any rate, I hope you enjoy this conference, and thanks so much for taking some time to spend with me today. Appreciate it.